I was driving through a small town late at night, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. My gas tank was low, and my stomach was growling louder than the engine. I had been on the road for hours, and all I wanted was a hot meal and a place to rest. That's when I saw the sign for Rosie's Diner, glowing in the distance like a beacon in the dark. I pulled off the highway and into the parking lot. The diner was small, with a single neon sign flickering above the door. A few old cars were parked out front, but otherwise, the place looked deserted. I figured it was the perfect spot to grab a bite before heading back on the road. The moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The diner was too quiet, the booths were empty, and the air was thick with the smell of old grease and burnt coffee. A single waitress stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag. She didn't look up as I walked in. I cleared my throat. "Hey, is the kitchen still open?" The waitress slowly turned to face me. Her face was pale, her eyes dull, like she hadn't slept in days. She gave me a weak smile and nodded. "Sit anywhere you like," she said, her voice flat and tired. I took a seat at the booth by the window, the vinyl cracked and worn under me. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Old-fashioned jukeboxes sat at every table, though none of them were playing. The waitress came over, dragging her feet as she walked. She handed me a greasy menu and stood there, staring blankly at me while I looked it over. "Coffee, please," I said, glancing up at her. She nodded and shuffled away. I couldn't help but notice how strange she moved, slow, like she was underwater. My eyes wandered around the diner. There were pictures on the walls, black and white photos of people who looked like they'd lived 100 years ago. The kind of folks you'd see in an old history book. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. After a minute, the waitress returned with the coffee. She set it down in front of me without a word, the cup clinking against the table. As she walked away, I took a sip, immediately regretting it. The coffee was lukewarm and bitter, tasting more like sludge than anything else. I pushed the cup aside and waited for her to come back from my order, but she didn't. I looked around, expecting her to be behind the counter, but she was gone. The diner was completely empty. My heart started to race. Where had she gone? I hadn't even heard the door open. I stood up, looking toward the kitchen. "Hello? Anyone back there?" No answer. Feeling uneasy, I walked to the counter and peeked through the little window into the kitchen. The lights were dim, and I could see old pots and pans hanging from the walls, but no sign of the cook. The whole place looked abandoned. Suddenly, the door to the kitchen creaked open. I jumped, my pulse quickening. A figure stood in the doorway, just a shadow at first, but as it stepped into the light, I saw it was an old man. His clothes were dirty and torn, his skin gray and wrinkled like he'd been out in the sun too long. His eyes were dark and hollow, like the waitress's, and he just stood there, staring at me. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't respond. He just kept staring, his face completely expressionless. I backed away from the counter, my stomach twisting with unease. Something was very wrong here. I grabbed my jacket and turned to leave, but when I reached the door, it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but it was stuck. I looked back over my shoulder, and the man was still standing there, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as panic set in. "Let me out," I yelled, banging on the door. That's when I heard it. A low rumbling sound, like a growl, coming from the back of the diner. I turned, my eyes wide with fear, and saw the waitress again, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, more figures were emerging from the shadows, dozens of them, old and gray like the man, their faces empty and lifeless. They moved slowly, dragging their feet like they were barely alive, their dead eyes locked on me. I backed away, my hands shaking. "What do you want?" I screamed, but they didn't answer. They just kept coming, moving closer and closer. I ran to the nearest window, trying to smash it with a chair, but it wouldn't break. The glass felt solid, like it was reinforced. I was trapped. The figures were closing in, their cold, lifeless hands reaching for me. I could feel the air around me growing colder, the smell of decay filling my nose. My vision blurred as the panic took over. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a salt shaker, and threw it at them, but it passed right through their bodies, like they weren't even there. And then, just as they were about to touch me, everything stopped. The lights flickered, and suddenly the figures were gone. The diner was empty again, quiet as a tomb. I stood there, breathing hard, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't wait to find out. I ran back to the door, and this time, it opened. I rushed outside, gasping for air, and jumped into my truck. The diner's lights flickered behind me as I sped away, not daring to look back. I don't know what I saw in that diner, but I'll never forget it. And if you ever find yourself driving through a small town late at night, and you see a place called Rosie's Diner, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. It was almost midnight, and I was starving. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it to the next town, but I couldn't wait any longer. That's when I saw the small, neon sign on the side of the road, Millie's Diner. The flickering light was the only thing in sight for miles. I pulled my car into the empty parking lot and cut the engine. The diner looked old, like it hadn't been touched in years. The paint was peeling, and the windows were covered in a thin layer of dust, but I didn't care. I just wanted some food. When I pushed open the door, a little bell above it jingled. Inside, it was just as empty as outside. There were a few booths, a long counter with stools, and a jukebox in the corner that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. The place smelled like old grease and stale coffee. Behind the counter, a woman stood wiping down the same spot over and over. She was older, maybe in her S, with a tired face and dull eyes. Her uniform was faded, and her name tag read, Millie. "Sit anywhere," she said without looking up. I took a seat at the counter, and Millie slid a menu in front of me. It was sticky and worn, but I didn't need to read it. "Just a cheeseburger and some fries, please," I said, trying to be polite. She nodded, still not looking at me, and shuffled into the back to place the order. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The diner was too quiet. Not even the sound of a fridge humming or the sizzle of a grill. Just silence. I glanced around. The booths were all empty, and the clock on the wall wasn't moving. After a few minutes, Millie came back with a cup of coffee. She set it down in front of me, her eyes never leaving the counter. I took a sip, hoping it would calm my nerves, but the coffee tasted bitter and cold, like it had been sitting out for hours. I set the cup down and looked up at Millie. "Is everything all right here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She paused for a moment, then looked up at me, her eyes dull and empty. "We don't get many customers this late," she said softly. "Not since the accident." I frowned. "Accident?" Millie didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes locked onto mine. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but before I could ask more, she turned and went back into the kitchen. As I sat there, waiting for my food, the silence in the diner grew heavier. I tried to ignore it, but something felt wrong. It was like the air was too thick, too still. I checked the time on my phone, but the screen was dead. No signal. Nothing. That's when I noticed the booths. At first glance, they looked empty. But when I looked closer, I saw shadows, faint outlines of people sitting there, watching me. My heart started to race. I blinked, and the shadows were gone. I shook my head, trying to tell myself I was just tired, that it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Finally, Millie came back with my burger and fries. She set the plate down in front of me, but I had lost my appetite. The burger looked greasy, and the fries were limp and cold. Still, I forced myself to take a bite, hoping it would settle my nerves. As I chewed, I glanced up at the mirror behind the counter. My reflection stared back at me. But something was wrong. There was someone sitting in the booth behind me. I turned around quickly, but the booth was empty. My heart pounded in my chest. I looked back at the mirror. This time, there were more figures, shadowy, faceless shapes sitting in all the booths, watching me. I stood up, knocking over my coffee cup. "I think I need to go," I muttered, backing away from the counter. Millie didn't stop me. She just stood there, staring with that same blank expression, as if she was waiting for something. As I rushed to the door, the air around me grew colder, and I felt something brush against my arm, cold, like ice. I yanked open the door and bolted to my car, my heart racing. When I got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, my hands shaking. I glanced back at the diner, and through the dusty windows, I saw them. The booths were filled with shadowy figures, all sitting still, all staring at me. I didn't wait. I slammed the car into gear and sped out of the parking lot, my headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached the next town. Later, I tried to find out more about Millie's diner, but there was nothing, no records, no signs that it even existed. It was as if the place had disappeared, just like the shadows in the booths. And now, every time I drive at night, I can't help but look for that flickering neon sign. I don't know if I'd ever find it again, but I'm sure of one thing. I'll never stop at a diner after midnight again. I had been driving for hours. It was late, past midnight, and I was exhausted. The road stretched on for miles, dark and empty. I needed a break, something to eat, and maybe a cup of coffee to keep me going. That's when I saw the sign for Betty's Diner. The neon lights flickered in the distance, cutting through the thick night. I was relieved to see it. A warm meal and a few minutes off the road sounded perfect. I pulled into the parking lot, which was almost empty. Only one other car was parked there, an old rusted thing that looked like it hadn't moved in years. The diner itself was small, with big windows that were fogged up from the cold outside. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out of the car. As soon as I opened the door, a little bell above it rang. The inside of the diner felt old, like stepping back in time. There were booths with cracked vinyl seats and a long counter lined with stools. The air smelled of coffee, grease, and something faintly metallic. The lights inside were dim, casting long shadows that made the place feel strange, almost like a dream. Behind the counter was a woman, probably in her late 50s, wearing an old-fashioned uniform. Her name tag read Betty. She smiled at me, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sit anywhere you like, hun," she said, her voice warm but somehow distant. I slid into one of the booths near the window and picked up the menu. It was short: burgers, fries, milkshakes. The usual diner fare. I didn't have much of an appetite, so I just ordered a coffee and a slice of pie. As I waited, I glanced around the diner. There was only one other customer, a man sitting at the far end of the counter. He was hunched over his plate, barely moving. His clothes looked old and worn, and his face was hidden under a large hat. Something about him seemed wrong, but I told myself it was just the late hour and my own tiredness playing tricks on me. Betty brought over the coffee and pie. The coffee smelled bitter, and the pie looked like it had been sitting out for hours. But I didn't care. I was just too tired to be picky. "Quiet night," I said, trying to make conversation. Betty looked at me for a moment, her smile fading slightly. "We don't get many visitors this time of night," she said, her voice low. "Not many folks come around these parts anymore." I nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It was cold and tasted awful. I set the cup down and pushed it aside, focusing on the pie instead. As I took a bite, I noticed something strange. The man at the counter hadn't moved, not once. He just sat there, staring at his plate. A chill ran down my spine. I decided to ignore it. I was tired after all, and probably imagining things. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt like something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, like the diner was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Betty stood behind the counter, her back to me, cleaning a glass. I glanced again at the man, and that's when I realized he wasn't eating. He wasn't even breathing. His body was completely still, like a statue. My heart started to race. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "Is that guy okay?" Betty didn't turn around. "Don't mind him," she said softly. "He's been here a long time." I swallowed hard. "How long?" Betty turned then slowly and looked at me with eyes that seemed much too dark. "Longer than you think," she said, her voice flat. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the diner dropped. I shivered, feeling a cold draft brush past me. The man at the counter shifted slightly, his head tilting just enough for me to see his face, or what was left of it. His skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were sunken, hollow, and dark as night. I gasped, pushing myself back in the booth, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around the diner, and for the first time, I noticed the details I had missed before, the faded pictures on the wall, showing faces that looked eerily familiar. The same faces as the people I had seen sitting in the diner, still and silent. I jumped to my feet, ready to run, but the door to the diner wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, panic rising in my throat, but it was locked tight. Betty stood behind the counter, watching me with that same strange smile. "You can't leave," she said, her voice calm. "Not yet." I turned, my back pressed against the door, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The man at the counter had turned fully now, his empty eyes staring right at me. "You're one of us now," Betty said softly, her smile widening. I shook my head, refusing to believe what was happening. This had to be a nightmare. I bolted for the kitchen door, hoping to find another way out, but as I passed the counter, I felt something cold grab my wrist. I looked down, and the man at the counter had latched onto me with his bony hand, his grip ice cold. I screamed, yanking my arm free and stumbling back. I ran into the kitchen, my heart pounding in my ears, but the moment I entered, I stopped dead in my tracks. The kitchen was empty, dark, and there, in the center of the room, was a single table, set with plates and silverware. But the plates weren't for food. They were covered in dust and old bloodstains. I backed away, horrified, only to hear footsteps behind me. "Stay," Betty's voice whispered from the doorway. I turned, but there was no one there, just the endless shadows of the diner stretching on forever, as if the night had swallowed the entire place. And in that moment, I knew I would never leave. It was late, past midnight, and I was driving down a dark, empty road. My stomach growled, and I knew I needed to stop for food. That's when I saw it, an old diner on the side of the road, its neon sign flickering in the night, Sam's Diner. I hadn't seen another building for miles, so I pulled into the empty parking lot. The place looked run down, like it hadn't been updated in years. But it was open, and I was hungry. I grabbed my wallet and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. The diner was small, with a few booths and a long counter with stools. The lights were dim, and there was a strange, musty smell in the air, like old cooking oil. A man sat at the counter, hunched over a cup of coffee, but other than him, the place was empty. Behind the counter stood an old waitress. She wore a faded uniform and a name tag that said, Sue. Her face was pale, and her eyes looked tired. "Take a seat," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. I sat down at one of the booths, the leather cracked and worn. Sue handed me a menu, but I didn't really need it. I just wanted something simple, so I ordered a burger, fries, and a cup of coffee. As I waited, I looked around the diner. It felt strange, too quiet, too still. The man at the counter hadn't moved since I came in. His head was down, and he seemed to be staring into his coffee. Something about him made me uneasy. Sue came back with my coffee and set it down in front of me. I thanked her, but she didn't respond. She just turned and walked back behind the counter, her footsteps slow and heavy. I took a sip of the coffee, and immediately I knew something was off. It was cold, bitter, like it had been sitting for hours. I set the cup down and glanced at the man at the counter again. He still hadn't moved. That's when I noticed something strange. The jukebox in the corner was flickering, even though no music was playing. The lights on it blinked on and off, casting odd shadows around the room. The longer I sat there, the more I felt like something wasn't right. Finally, Sue brought my food. The burger looked greasy, and the fries were limp and pale. I took a bite, but it tasted old, like it had been cooked hours ago. My stomach turned, and I pushed the plate away. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to be polite, though I didn't really want to stay much longer. Sue didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at me with those tired eyes. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind her gaze, something dark. The man at the counter moved then, just a little. His hand twitched, and he turned his head slightly toward me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to leave, but something kept me in my seat. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was fear. I wasn't sure. I watched Sue shuffle back behind the counter, her back to me. The man at the counter finally turned to face me. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull. He stared at me with a blank expression, like he wasn't really seeing me at all. Suddenly, I felt trapped. The air in the diner grew cold, and my breath came out in short, shaky gasps. I stood up, my heart pounding, and made my way to the door. But as I reached for the handle, I felt a cold hand grab my arm. I turned around, expecting to see the man or Sue, but no one was there. I yanked my arm free and bolted for the door, pushing it open and running out into the night. I jumped into my car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. The diner wasn't there. The parking lot was empty, and the neon sign was gone. It was like the diner had never existed at all. I don't know what I saw that night, but I've never driven down that road again, and I never will.